So, hello, yes, my name is Sophie. Who am I? I'm a designer, as well pointed out by Dominic. Be designing particularly communication design and behaviour change, specifically looking at sustainability for nearly 20 years, which is a pretty long time to do it, and we've seen a huge amount of change, and if you think about it over those last 20 years. But I'm also a bit of a curious beast because I'm also one of the first designers to be a chartered waste manager for CIWM. I am also now on the board of trustees for WRAP. So I'm kind of one of these people who hates waste, is curious about why we have waste in the system, and thinking, now there is a connection. There is a connection between the way we are designing and the way that our systems and the way that we live is kind of like failing us quite badly. And is this actually about the kind of work and the industry that I am in day to day? So I'm going to, just before I start talking about the design industry per se, I just want to show you this book, and some of you may have seen this, so apologies. But this is my mum's edition of the 1942 edition of the Citizens' Advice Notes. Now this book was given to all the ARP wardens in the UK at the time by all the government on how we had to live at that time of, and particularly in the middle of the war. And what's interesting about this book is that in the section which is written by the Ministry of Supply, there's a whole thing about salvage. And these are the two particular sections on waste paper and rags, ropes and string. And the fact that actually, at that point, we had no we had very few raw materials coming into the UK because we had this big, what was called the tonnage war at that point, at the Atlantic. Well, a lot of our boats were getting bombed by the U-boats, and actually they were stopping a lot of our raw materials coming into the UK. So actually we needed this kind of material that was going round in the society, like string, bits of paper, couldn't be used for gratuitous marketing, which is basically what I do now. It couldn't be used for, couldn't be thrown away, couldn't be used to wrap food unless it was very particular food like butter. And the fact that if you put it into a waste bin with something else, that was completely prohibited. And actually the Ministry of Supply had organised a series of volunteers that would go around, and they were called what were they called? The salvage stewards. And they were volunteers across the whole of the UK who actually went into households, went into industry, were supported by experts to say, hold on a minute, you can't throw that away, that has to go into this bin. So it's a really kind of interesting, sort of historically to see this. And then to sort of think about how different it is now that we're in this kind of society where we actually sort of identify ourselves with the way that we dress. We have children who have aspirations to own handbags rather than to become astronauts. So, I mean, that's quite extreme, obviously. But, the extremes are quite interesting for me because, you hear all these horrendous stories about people, this kind of hoarding nature that we have, about people, like kind of getting lost, and all these programs on the telly about, kind of people's terrible, and it's a real mental problem. So this is my industry. We are kind of a funny old bunch, I would say. We are wasteful, but we don't really see it. So we don't really understand the consequences of how we design stuff. So product development. We create desire, built around potentially built-in obsolescence of products. A whole advertising campaign built about changing something again and then again on top of that. For me, that's quite dubious. We're also very fashion-focused. We're often in denial about being driven around aesthetics, form and function, never really about environmental sustainability. And we don't really think about where it ends up once it becomes like not useful. So when we start defining it as waste, and that's what we have termed like basically materials being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So those plastics in the oceans that we were hearing about earlier, fantastic material, massive amount of identity problems that I would say that plastic has, that we have with it. That's about material being in the wrong place. And from the outside in, you would sort of look at our industry and look at design and say, it's particularly if you stand at the bottom of a pile of this stuff, you'd realise that actually we don't really seem that bothered about environmental issues, about sustainability. Because our eyes are on other prizes. You know, our prizes and our awards, as Dominic was saying, are about things like the aesthetics, about the way it works, about the functionality. Very, very rarely about sustainability. And if they are, they often do end up being a kind of niche off in the corner, a white pencil over there, which I have judged. And you just think, well, that's great, but actually shouldn't it be like one of the main reasons why you get an award in the first place should be about the fact that you actually can recover the material, that it is sustainable in a way that it's about reuse, or it's about repair, or it's about recycling. Design is often the very last department to hear about sustainability. So a lot of companies that we work with, you know, they have this thing, right, we're going to bring in sustainability or circular economy and resource efficiency into the way that we start thinking about our business. And we're like, great, that's really good. Have you talked to your design innovation people yet? And they're like, oh no, we'll come to that in a minute. We'll come to that later on and down the line. But actually, what we were saying is that that innovation, that kind of spark that designers have to really push those ideas which are like sort of crazy but might just work out there, is actually exactly the right energy that you need to really bump start sustainability to a place where actually it becomes really, really effective and efficient and really does shift, because all of this stuff needs a massive shift, a massive reinvention of how we do things in a societal way. And you can see that when you start talking about waste streams like plastic. Interesting enough, that this is the R&D labs for Gillette, and Gillette spend about $2 billion a year on R&D of their razor blade heads on their Gillette Fusion, which is quite interesting when you think about the lifespan of that head is about 5 weeks. So that's, you know, that's the kind of investment which actually you think, well, if you imagine putting into that brief, let's design it for second or third use. Let's design to think about how we can create something that isn't about disposability, but thinks about something in a different way. That could be quite a powerful place to start. So, again, design really is about the impact of things. And actually, I talk a lot about this statistic, and I've tried to unpick it a bit the last 4 years. But it's really, really interesting, because it's not just about the designer. I mean, we always think about the designer on their own, sitting with their kind of turtleneck jumper. I don't know what you might not wear. Turtleneck jumpers, and with your moleskin sketchbooks and iPads, etc. But actually, this is about the design chain, the people around them, who writes the brief, how we spec materials, how we make things, what's the manufacturing process, all of these different things coming together, the marketing, big issue about marketing. So all of that actually is a very, very powerful percentage of how we're designing things to actually become, if we're thinking about the opportunities, and it is a good news story about design, actually, we can really push forward, because this is a really, really powerful group of people to get on board for this, you know, if we're talking about sustainability and longevity, etc. So this kind of like light bulb moment that we have, I mean, I think it's very interesting. We have to sort of step a little bit back from this and talk about the normality for the moment. So the normality in the UK and globally is a very linear process, and I'm sure you've talked a lot about that, you know, throughout the years, or throughout, you know, even through today. You know, this kind of we take stuff out of the ground, we make it into materials, we process it, we make it into products, we use the products, then we kind of throw it away, or we just abandon it in a drawer somewhere or something like that, and it becomes a waste stream very quickly. And what's interesting is the life of our products has shrunk. So actually, when we talk about disposability, or fast fashion, or cheap electronics, it's almost like disposability used to be just the area where we're talking about single-use plastic, you know, kind of coffee cups or that. But now actually it's seeping into all of the stuff around us. So this kind of disposability, we don't really think about things having quality. They actually become, packaging almost takes on a negative value once it's finished holding a sandwich. So it's about the kind of identity and the sort of revaluing our material streams. So I went on a UKTI mission in about 2011, to look at designing out landfill. We went to the Netherlands, and one of the things I saw when I was there was a really, really high-tech fridge recycling facility, where they had all these sea containers come along, and they'd put them up and then open them out, and there'd be all these fridges would come out, and they were all different. They came from all around Europe, and then they had this really high-tech facility on one end, which would take a fridge, crush it, break it into all its materials, take the gas off, plastic over there, aluminium. But what happened here, well, these guys were actually having to take all the valuable bits out of the back of the fridge before it got into the crusher, which is the compressor at the back, mainly. So what was happening was that these guys were like having to go really quickly because there was a clock up there, and they had to assess the back of this fridge really quickly. Now, every fridge that was coming along was different. Some were made of plastic, some were the aluminium, some of them were mixed, some of them still had food in them. And they sort of flipped them over, and they'd have to drain all the liquids out, and then they'd have to work out how many screwdrivers they needed, which type of screwdriver, which type of tools, and every fridge was different. And I was like, God, this is really crazy that we have no rules about some things like that, about the kind of uniformity of how we design things. So because of this sort of completely different change, there's no legality about how many screws you put in the back of a fridge or anything, the way we design things. So I was like, wouldn't it be great if we could like line up all the fridge designers behind this guy and say, look how hard you're making his job. Look how difficult it is for him to get the value out of that fridge. You're making his life bloody hard just because you're like not really thinking about it, or you're not actually designing it. You're probably just thinking about ease of manufacturing, assembly line construction. You're not thinking about the ease of unmanufacturing or deconstruction. So from that, we decided that we would create a project which is basically taking everything we could find, which ranged from lipsticks, packaging, fountain pens, paper cups, sofas, luggage, bits of luggage, electronics, oil rigs, trucks. I think that's as far as we got. It was our big sort of scheme. And we would take them apart, and we would collect all these people together, designers, so all the people from the design chain, chemists, anthropologists, policymakers, businesses, get everyone together and really sort of work out what was going on here and work out what kind of impact design could have. If it is 80%, how we could actually change that for a much better structure. And this is where we started. We started at facilities like this. So we took people here, we took the network, and we took them to landfill sites, energy from waste sites, recycling piles. We showed them best practice, so they went to recycling facilities that were at the cutting edge. So we didn't take them to the Netherlands, but effectively it's very similar places. And we looked at all different streams: plastics, textiles, bulky waste. We did electronics, oil rigs, as I said, and things like that. So everything, we just really, really went and scrutinised all of these different things and worked out what was going wrong, what was best practice, what could we learn from. And what was really interesting is actually getting designers to talk to people from waste management companies. These guys hold all the knowledge about where our products are failing. So it was a really useful experience for everybody. Then we took stuff off of the pile. We got everyone to take it apart. We gave them tools and some PPE, just in case you're worried about their health and safety. And we filmed it all. And we got people in who kind of knew what was going on. So Mark Shaler, I don't know if he kind of knows what's going on. You'll kill me for saying that, but it's all right. I saw him this morning. So, people who really understood things. And it was really interesting that designers didn't know things like why there was a lump of concrete in a washing machine. I don't know how they expected it not to crawl across the floor when they put it on a fast spin, but and we found these really interesting things like the fact that we thought built-in obsolescence was a kind of didn't happen anymore, and suddenly you find all these hidden catches in electronics, and you find things with strange messages on saying "Do not reuse me," and you think, well, we know it's just a piece of electronics. Why can't I reuse you? And it's all about intellectual property. It's all about all these other things that come into play. We also got our friends to help us. So this is Howell, who blended my old iPhone, and And we looked at what was in it, and that was quite interesting, because I don't know how many of you know what's in an iPhone, over 40 different elements are in a phone, and they're all there for a reason. But isn't it? I mean, you just find out all this stuff, and it's really, really fascinating, because a lot of those things are elements that are actually on critical endangered element lists. They have problems. We just don't know how to get them out. We haven't got the economic, or we have actually got solutions to get this stuff out of our electronic waste, but it's not economically viable yet. But it's kind of in such tiny proportions, spread across all of our stuff that's in our houses, and the 85 million old phones that we have hidden in drawers and cupboards around the UK, etc. And we talked to these guys. These guys are really fascinating. They really know how wasteful we are as a society. Even, people like me who've been working in waste industry and in design for so long, you think you do the best you can, and then these guys are just like, they talk about the GLAR. I don't know if any of you know about the GLAR, which is the crap at the bottom of your bin that you don't actually know what to do with once you've got rid of most stuff. And they're like, and this was at a community recycling centre in Kingston, and they were saying, God, people just, when they have house clearances, they have a kind of pile of things, they're like, I don't know what to do with it, and they kind of just put it all in a black bin bag, and they just shove it off and hope that no one notices, and they hide it away. But what they do there is they say, I'm going to open that bin bag for you because it's, it's part of my job. And people get really upset about this, but they do it. And amazingly, they find loads of things like paper, which is actually, we have really good recycling for paper in the UK. So fascinating stuff, really interesting. This is why we work with anthropologists a lot, because they you find a lot of stories about this stuff. We also talk to experts like this. This is Nick, who, when he was working at Closed Loop, so talking about plastics. And then we track things. So we would look at the routes for where stuff went from household all the way to the guys who reprocessed it, whether it stayed in the UK, whether it went over to Europe. And that's really fascinating too, because our stuff really does travel. It's a commodity, it's a valuable material, even at waste level. And we hear stories about success as well. This is a successful story done by that Nick was telling us about milk bottles. So the fact that we have a great love for semi-skim milk meant that when they recycled those bottles with the green tops, it gave a slight tinge to the recycled plastic. And everyone said, oh, people won't want to drink milk out of slightly grey plastic bottles because they'll think it's off. So there was a lot of discussion. And with WRAP, they worked out, they brought a load of people together around the room, and they worked out that actually if they just reduced the dye amount in the top of the lid by about 70% in the end, you can still tell it's semi-skim milk, so it's still got a green top, but actually you get less of a grey bottle in the end. So we filmed it all, and we now have 40 films on our channel, and we have over about 140,000 people have seen our films, and they're up there. You can have a look at them anytime you like. And they're very interesting. So what I want to do briefly, so now I'm warbling on, but it's so exciting. I get really enthusiastic about all this stuff, because it's also positive. It's all about actually the power of design really changing the way we do things, not just sitting back and saying, well, we could do a beach cleanup, which is absolutely right, but actually I'm in a position where I could think about how do I actually stop that plastic going in the ocean in the first place? How am I designing my product which makes it so difficult to take the plastic out, which is why it will end up in a landfill site, which then gets blown off, which then ends up in the sea. So I can sort of think about it to stop it getting in there in the first place. It's a much better position to be in, I think, particularly for a designer. So some of our outcomes, that project ran for 4 years, and it just finished this March. And we want to see some of the outcomes go back into industry. So here are some of the things that we found out. To build circular economy and to design for circular economy, you have to have a bigger team. You cannot rely on just the designer and the design brief. You have to have all those people that I was talking about. The role of the convener is really, really important in that. The convener is somebody who sits in a kind of unbiased position, but can actually ask very, very tricky questions to that group, which is really important. They allow for that risky space. They allow for inspiration. They question things. And this can be government, this can be Europe, this can be local authority, this can be the RSA, which it was in our position with Innovate UK. The circular network, really, really key. This is my design team. This is where I find all the people that I want to work with, whether they're resource managers at the top, policymakers, investors, and academics, or the supply chain, which goes from yellow to red. So how do I find the people who know the knowledge that help me make my decisions as a designer? We have to start at the end. We have to have those waste decisions right at the beginning of the discussion about how we design things, which is really, really key. And you do that by really mixing up, again, going from the design perspective, but really understanding who are the innovators. And a lot of the innovators we found were actually in the resource management side of businesses. You have to have safe fail spaces for disruption and prototyping. You know, these are spaces where people, it's a bit like a Venn diagram where disruptors, early adopters and kind of crazy designer types meet big businesses and people who are thinking about how they have to change the way that they're designing their products. And it's that middle space that's really important, that you can kind of fail, test, fail, prototype out, etc. It's really, really key. And that's currently quite a difficult space to find in this environment. You have to think about the design models. So we design for systems, not products. You have to think about, it's all well and good designing a really, really good product, which can be disassembled really, really quickly if it goes into the established infrastructure and gets put in a crusher or sent to energy from waste. So it's really about understanding how you design a system for your product. It could be about leasing, it could be about fixing, it could be about reuse of them, particularly with a manufacturer, so going back to that manufacturer after it's finished. But that system is really, really important. And that's where circular business models are really taking off in that area. So really thinking about starting right from scratch. All of our products seem to be commingled. It doesn't matter where we looked, whether it was a sofa, whether it was a paper cup, all of these products, like made with multi layers of materials. And actually, if we're going to do that, the complexity of trying to get these materials out gets very difficult. So how can we design things which aren't so complex in the first place? Can we be clever about the way we design things in that way? Perhaps we should think about rewriting the brief. Perhaps we should get waste managers to write the brief in the first place. They can give us a lot of knowledge. It'd be quite crazy if I can imagine some great briefs coming out of you, Ray. You design things. We should definitely choice edit our products. We have so much stuff in our world. A lot of it doesn't sit on any system. A lot of it is designed for single use with materials which will last and last and last. You know, we don't really need a lot of this stuff. So we could start choice editing properly if we're brave enough. We know that people have really good intentions. Often things are thwarted by systems. So, you know, if you go to a community recycling centre and you see someone carefully putting their TV, which still kind of works, right next to this electronic skip in the hope that someone else will pick it up and take it away, that's completely the wrong thing. Because as soon as that TV touches the ground, we found out that the duty of care is that the guys who work there have to put it in the skip. So actually, what the best thing to do would be to completely redesign the way you go around that recycling facility and actually have a reuse place right at the beginning, not at the end, is where a lot of them sat. So things like that, really, really thinking about the way that we design our processes around that is key. Volume versus value is a real issue for us because actually the value of the material, you know, again, going back to that funny story about the CRC, so the Community Recycling Centre, they loved it when it rained because actually their skip, particularly for the carpet bit, was heavier. So they actually got their targets quicker if it was raining. So things like that, just really crazy. You just think, this system surely isn't right. And actually, you know, they had a metal skip where they were seeing a lot of copper go into that skip, and they realised actually that had more value than the scrap metal that they would get for the volume of the skip, so they took it out. But it actually meant that they lost money because the skip didn't fill up so quickly. So, you know, there's a whole kind of issue around how we reward finding the value in these materials rather than actually just going for full-on volume. And other things about this kind of relationship. So how do these people fit together? So we really, really pushed for design, for materials and waste to sit very, very closely in the design process. The legal landscape around recycled materials, again, incredibly complicated for us. And just some of the stuff, this was one of the messages we found on some of on the circuit boards. I mean, there is absolutely no reason why that message is there. It doesn't even explain itself. So all of this stuff is just really, really complicated. And I think we have these massive supply chains that sort of spin around the world so many times. How do we keep hold of these things? How do we really, really understand them and get to grips with them and get full transparency on the way that we make things? And that's been the key for us. This is just to give you an idea, this is a source map that Mark did of a £300 laptop from coltan to shop. And that's like a £300 laptop. How can that be cost that much? It's so crazy. But this is the kind of thing that we're sort of fighting against when we think about simplifying or making things better for a resource-efficient process. And until those true costs are really factored in, it's going to be very difficult to prove the economic advantage of the reuse and recovery, because actually just so enormous. So yeah, when we take things apart, great stories come out of it, great observations, great insights. And how do we deal with that? How is it, we've got this kind of crazy thing going on where everyone passes on the blame around a circular system. So actually the designer says, well, it's not my fault, it's the brief's fault, and the brief guy goes, it's the marketing guys. So actually really putting it together will stop things like this happening, where you end up with a piece of packaging which is pretty much plastic apart from the metal spring, which used to be plastic, but then the unit cost of it went up by a tiny fraction. And because we're talking about these economics of scale, they changed it for metal, which meant that along down the line, the recycling guys had to add in a magnet into their system to get that out. So, but who pays for that? I mean, those guys aren't going to pay for it because they haven't got that. We don't have a system of responsibility of that. So if the one thing I leave you before I stop warbling on about and ranting on about design is this, that actually waste is really about the design. It's a flaw in the way that we're designing things. It's a flaw in the way that my brief is written, that the marketeer guys are pushing forward, and a society is kind of accepting. And we have to actually reinvent the whole thing. But it's such a brilliant challenge. So thank you.